The corn is there, mountains of it. Golden piles stretch to the horizon in Iowa and Nebraska, but the ships that should carry it to Asia sit empty. Tariffs, port fees, and political crossfire have turned America's proudest export into a stranded commodity. What once symbolized abundance now reeks of waste. Across the Pacific, buyers are already moving on. Japan, South Korea, and China are scouting alternatives, signing deals with anyone who can deliver on time. Into that void steps Canada. Viral clips circulate of Canadian grain trains rumbling west, bound for ports that promise fewer headlines and less drama. It doesn't matter whether the numbers match the hype. The story is enough to sting. So, the question echoes from Washington to Winnipeg. Has America's agricultural empire hit a breaking point? And if so, who stands ready to inherit its crown? For decades, the United States set the tempo of global agriculture. Corn flowed like clockwork down the Mississippi, loaded onto barges, then into ocean carriers bound for Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai. The rhythm was steady, the trust implicit. Buyers in Asia barely hesitated before signing long-term contracts with American exporters. Canada, meanwhile, was present but peripheral, exporting wheat, canola, and barley, but rarely competing head-to-head with U.S. corn. The balance of power was lopsided, and for years it seemed unshakable. But history has a way of shifting beneath familiar ground. Tensions that had simmered for years burst into the open when tariffs became Washington's weapon of choice. Trump's administration imposed a 25% duty on Canadian and Mexican goods, then escalated the fight with China, inviting a punishing 34% tariff on American corn in return. Layered on top were U.S. port fees targeting Chinese-linked vessels, driving shipping costs to historic highs. Suddenly, the machinery of global grain trade began to sputter. Contracts stalled, importers balked, and whispers spread across Asia. Maybe America was no longer the reliable supplier it once was. In the silence of canceled orders, Canada heard its chance. Trump's trade doctrine was blunt. Hit competitors hard, shield American producers, and force trading partners back to the table. In practice, it detonated under its own weight. By early 2025, America's agricultural exports, once the backbone of rural prosperity, were ensnared in tariffs from every direction. Washington slapped a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican imports, doubling duties on Chinese goods. Beijing retaliated with a 34% levy on U.S. corn, soybeans, and wheat, slicing deep into markets that accounted for billions in sales. But tariffs weren't the only grenade. In late 2024, the White House introduced new port fees of up to $1.5 million per voyage for vessels tied to Chinese ownership. The stated goal was reviving American shipbuilding. The reality was an immediate shortage of bulk carriers. Shipping rates exploded, rising from around $40 per ton to over $70. Contracts unraveled as Asian buyers balked at the costs and delays. The Corn Belt felt the blow viscerally. In Iowa, grain elevators filled beyond capacity, forcing farmers to pile corn outdoors under plastic tarps, praying weather wouldn't ruin it. Ethanol plants in Illinois scaled back as exports dried up, workers sent home early. For farmers who had voted for Trump on promises of prosperity, the result was a bitter irony. The protection they were promised became a blockade around their own harvest. North of the border, the crisis landed like a windfall. Prairie farmers in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, who had long endured second-class status in the corn market, suddenly found Asia calling. The Canadian Grain Commission recorded a rise in export inquiries, particularly from Japanese feed buyers and South Korean processors who had grown wary of U.S. unpredictability. Ottawa played its hand carefully. Canadian diplomats made no boastful claims, but the message was deliberate. We may not rival America's volume, but we will deliver. On social media, videos of Canadian trains hauling grain to Pacific ports racked up millions of views under headlines like "Canada replaces US in Asia." Whether exaggerated or not, The optics mattered. Buyers saw stability in Canada's understated pitch, yet opportunity brought strain. The port of Vancouver, Canada's main gateway to Asia, buckled under the new surge. Already congested with coal, potash, and lumber, it now faced longer queues of bulk carriers waiting for grain. Rail companies like CN and CP ran their lines at near full throttle, forcing delays that tested farmers' patience. Communities across the prairies felt the squeeze. Truckers idled for hours, storage bins filled to bursting, demurrage fees mounted. Still, Canada's advantage lay in perception. It didn't need to replace the US entirely. It only needed to look like the safer bet. In 2025, reliability was a commodity more valuable than sheer tonnage, and Canada was selling it with precision. Today, the US and Canada face a stalemate that neither fully controls. In Washington, tariffs remain politically untouchable. Trump rallies paint them as proof of strength, even as farmers drown in unsold grain. Officials insist the pain is temporary, that America will emerge stronger, but patience is evaporating across the Corn Belt. Farmers who once cheered the trade war now describe it as a war against themselves. In Canada, optimism is tempered by reality. Infrastructure caps how much grain it can move. Vancouver's congestion threatens credibility, and every delay risks eroding the trust Ottawa is trying to build. Farmers may enjoy better prices for now, but they know any stumble could send Asian buyers back to the US or elsewhere, and that elsewhere is increasingly attractive. Brazil and Argentina have expanded corn acreage, while Ukraine and the Black Sea states aggressively court Asia. Buyers are diversifying, not replacing. The era when one North American nation alone could dominate appears to be ending. The fracture is not just economic, it is reputational. America, once synonymous with reliability, now wears the label of volatility. Canada, while gaining ground, is tethered by infrastructure. Asia has choices it never had before, and that reality may be the most enduring cost of all. For Canada, the shift in global grain dynamics has been both exhilarating and exhausting. Prairie farmers, long accustomed to trailing behind their US counterparts, suddenly saw a surge of opportunity. In towns across Saskatchewan and Manitoba, buyers from Asia began making calls. Japanese feed companies, Korean processors, even cautious Chinese importers looking to hedge against American volatility. Grain elevators that once struggled to compete with US volume were suddenly inundated with demand, but success carries weight. The Port of Vancouver, Canada's main artery to Asia, is stretched to breaking. Already burdened with coal, lumber, and container traffic, it now must absorb an influx of corn and soybean shipments. Rail lines operated by Canadian National and Canadian Pacific are jammed with traffic, causing delays that reverberate back to the prairies. Farmers who once celebrated higher bids now find themselves stuck in long queues, their trucks idling for hours outside overcapacity elevators. In one small town outside Regina, producers complain of demurrage charges, penalties imposed when shipments are delayed beyond contract deadlines. These fees erode profits, turning what look like windfall contracts into razor-thin margins. The optics may favor Canada internationally, but domestically, the story is more complicated. Stressed infrastructure, rising costs, and a sense that Canada's grain sector is sprinting faster than its legs can carry. Still, perception matters. Even if Canada cannot fully replace US exports, the very fact that it can step into the breach, even partially, shifts leverage. Ottawa knows it, farmers know it, and Asia, watching carefully, increasingly sees Canada not as a minor player, but as a credible alternative in a multipolar grain market. In the United States, the costs of the trade war are harder to spin. Corn once destined for Asia now sits unsold across the Midwest. In Iowa, co-ops report storage bins at 95% capacity, forcing excess grain into makeshift piles under plastic tarps, vulnerable to rain and rot. The glut drives down prices. Corn that fetched $6 a bushel in 2023 now struggles to sell for $4. Farmers' margins evaporate. The pain radiates outward. Ethanol plants in Illinois and Nebraska reliant on steady corn deliveries, have cut production, sending workers home early. Feedlots reduce herd sizes as input costs spike from transportation bottlenecks. The knock-on effects reach consumers. Grocery prices creep higher, meat costs rise, and the supposed shield of tariffs begins to look like a boomerang aimed at the heartland. Abroad, trust erodes even faster than profits. Japanese importers, once fiercely loyal to US corn, now diversify contracts with Brazil and Argentina. South American exporters, long in America's shadow, are suddenly courted as stable alternatives. South Korea describes US shipments as a gamble. The label stings because it was once unthinkable. For farmers, the betrayal feels personal. They were told tariffs would defend them. Instead, tariffs became walls around their own markets. "We don't need protection, we need customers," one Iowa farmer told Reuters. The quote has since become a bitter refrain across the Corn Belt. The reputational wound may be the deepest. America was once synonymous with reliability in global agriculture. Now it is viewed as volatile, unpredictable, even risky, and reputations once lost are not easily regained. For the US, the shared cost is not just economic, it is existential. The Corn War has become more than a question of trade. It is a test of North America's identity. On one side, US farmers face overflowing bins and broken promises, victims of tariffs that turned their harvests into bargaining chips. On the other, Canada enjoys rare momentum, yet its ports and railways groan under the weight of sudden demand. Across the Pacific, Asian buyers quietly rewire their supply chains, less dependent on America, more willing to gamble on new partners. Both nations now stand at a crossroads. Will Washington abandon political theater for pragmatic policy? Can Ottawa transform a fleeting moment into a lasting foothold? Or will South America and the Black Sea emerge as the real winners of this fracture? Like, comment, and subscribe to join the conversation.